The crystal champagne flute slipped from my cousin Penelope's fingers, shattering against the Italian marble floor of the Rosewood Grand Ballroom. Her face had gone the color of spoiled milk. Beside her, my ex-fiancé Trevor stood frozen, his mouth forming a perfect O of shock as he stared at the man whose arm was draped casually around my waist. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Natalie? Trevor finally managed, his voice cracking. Is that Dominic Ashford? My husband, all 6 feet 3 inches of old money confidence and devastating charm, extended his free hand with the kind of easy grace that comes from generations of inherited power. Dominic Ashford-Monroe, actually. Natalie took my name when we married last spring. And you must be the groom from that unfortunate incident several years back. What was it, 5 years ago now? Penelope's eyes darted between Dominic's Patek Philippe watch, his perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, and the understated wedding band that probably cost more than their mortgage. You married Dominic Ashford, she whispered, as if saying it too loudly might shatter the illusion. I smiled, the kind of serene smile I'd perfected over years of rebuilding myself from the ashes of humiliation. Actually, Penelope, we've been meaning to thank you both. If you hadn't run off together on what was supposed to be my wedding day, I never would have moved to Charleston. And I certainly never would have met Dominic at the Meridian Foundation Gala. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand the exquisite poetry of this moment, you need to know how it all began. You need to understand the woman I was before that devastating June afternoon 5 years ago, and the journey that transformed me into the woman who could stand in this ballroom, wearing a vintage Dior gown, with one of the most eligible men on the East Coast as my husband. 5 years earlier, I was Natalie Monroe, a 28-year-old elementary school teacher in the quiet town of Millbrook, nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. I'd spent the better part of 2 years planning what I believed would be the perfect wedding to Trevor Castellan, my college sweetheart and the man I'd foolishly believed was my soulmate. Our story had all the hallmarks of small-town romance. We'd met at Appalachian State University, both education majors with dreams of making a difference in children's lives. Trevor had been charming, attentive, and enthusiastic about our shared vision of settling down in Millbrook, teaching at the local schools, and eventually raising a family in the same mountains where I'd grown up. For 3 years, we built what I thought was a solid foundation. Weekend hikes along the Blue Ridge Parkway, lazy Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, dinners with my family where Trevor charmed everyone with his easy smile and quick wit. My parents adored him. My younger brother considered him a mentor. And my cousin Penelope, who'd moved to Millbrook after a messy divorce 2 years prior, had become one of our closest friends. I'd been so naive. The warning signs had been there, of course. They always are. Looking back with the clarity that only devastating betrayal can provide, I could see them scattered throughout those final months like breadcrumbs leading to disaster. Penelope had started joining us for everything. What began as occasional invitations for her to third-wheel our date nights gradually evolved into her constant presence. She's going through such a hard time, I'd told Trevor when he mildly suggested we needed more couple time. We can't abandon her when she needs support. How generous of me. How spectacularly blind. There were the lingering glances I convinced myself I'd imagined. The inside jokes that developed between them. The way Trevor's phone would buzz with texts from her at odd hours, always with reasonable explanations. Just checking about the wedding playlist. Asking advice about her new apartment lease. Wondering if we wanted to grab dinner. I'd been so consumed with wedding preparations that I'd missed the fundamental shift happening right under my nose. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent hours agonizing over seating charts and centerpieces while my fiancé was falling for my cousin. The wedding was set for June 15th at Riverside Chapel, a picturesque stone church overlooking the French Broad River. 200 guests. A reception at the historic Biltmore Estate. My dress, a custom creation from a boutique in Asheville, had taken 6 months to perfect. Every detail had been meticulously planned, from the heirloom roses in my bouquet to the vintage champagne we'd selected for the toast. The morning of my wedding day, I woke up in my childhood bedroom, sunlight streaming through lace curtains my grandmother had sewn 40 years earlier. My mother brought me coffee in bed, tears already forming in her eyes. My bridesmaids arrived at 8, a chattering gaggle of excitement and hairspray. Penelope was among them, my maid of honor, the person I'd trusted most to stand beside me on this day. She'd helped me into my dress, her fingers steady as she fastened the 40 tiny buttons running down my spine. She'd adjusted my veil, assured me I looked beautiful, and held my hands when I'd gotten nervous about the ceremony. What I didn't know was that 3 hours earlier, she'd been in Trevor's apartment. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock. By 1:30, all 200 guests were seated, fanning themselves in the June heat despite the chapel's air conditioning. The string quartet played Pachelbel's canon. The flowers perfumed the air. My father stood with me in the vestibule, looking distinguished in his tuxedo, ready to walk his only daughter down the aisle. At 1:45, Trevor's best man, Jason, approached us with an expression I'll never forget. Confusion mixed with panic mixed with something that looked like pity. "Mr. Monroe," he said quietly, pulling my father aside. "We have a situation." My father's face had gone pale as Jason whispered in his ear. I watched my dad's expression transform from joy to confusion to absolute fury in the span of 10 seconds. "Natalie, sweetheart," he'd said, his voice remarkably steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We need to go to the pastor's office." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In that small, book-lined room that smelled of old hymnals and furniture polish, my father handed me a letter. The paper was hotel stationery from the Mountain View Inn, where the bridal party had stayed the night before. Trevor's handwriting sprawled across the page in blue ink. "Natalie, I'm sorry. I can't do this. Penelope and we've fallen in love. We didn't mean for it to happen, but we can't deny what we feel anymore. I know this is cowardly, but I can't face you. We've left town. Please forgive us someday. T." The world had tilted sideways. 200 guests waiting in a chapel. A reception paid for and ready at the Biltmore estate. A honeymoon to Santorini with non-refundable tickets. And my fiancé had run off with my cousin. My mother's wail from the doorway told me she'd read the letter over my shoulder. The pastor's awkward pat on my arm. My father's quiet rage as he crumpled the letter in his fist. And me, standing there in $30,000 worth of custom wedding dress, unable to process that this was actually happening. "We need to tell the guests," the pastor said gently. What followed was perhaps the most humiliating hour of my life. My father walked out to that congregation of pitying faces and explained, with remarkable composure, that there would be no wedding. The groom and the maid of honor had eloped together. The gasps. The whispers. The carefully averted eyes as I walked back through the vestibule and out to the waiting limousine, still in my wedding dress, my dreams of happily ever after dissolving like sugar in rain. But that moment of public humiliation, as devastating as it was, would become the catalyst for everything that followed. The woman who climbed into that limousine, mascara streaking down her face, would not be the same woman who emerged on the other side of this catastrophe. To understand the sweetness of watching Penelope's face drain of color as Dominic Ashford introduced himself as my husband, you first need to understand the complete destruction that preceded my resurrection. The limousine driver had the decency not to make small talk as he drove me away from Riverside Chapel. Through the tinted windows, I watched Millbrook blur past, the town square where Trevor had proposed, the coffee shop where we'd spent countless Sunday mornings, the elementary school where we'd both accepted teaching positions starting that fall. A life that no longer existed. My parents had insisted I come home with them, but I couldn't bear the thought of their pitying looks or my mother's well-intentioned fussing. Instead, I directed the driver to take me to the one place I could think of, my best friend Lauren's apartment on the outskirts of town. Lauren took one look at me still in my wedding dress, mascara-stained and hollow-eyed, and simply opened her arms. I collapsed into them, and for the first time since reading that cowardly letter, I let myself truly break. The crying lasted for hours. Great, heaving sobs that left me gasping for air, my carefully styled hair falling in tangled waves around my shoulders, my custom dress wrinkling as I curled into a ball on Lauren's couch. She sat beside me, saying nothing, just present in that way only a true friend can be. When the tears finally subsided into hiccups and shuddering breaths, Lauren handed me a glass of water and asked the question I'd been dreading. What do you need? What did I need? I needed to rewind time. I needed to have seen the signs. I needed Trevor not to be a coward. I needed Penelope not to be a traitor. I needed my wedding day not to have ended in spectacular, public humiliation. I need to get out of this dress, I whispered. Lauren helped me out of the $30,000 gown, money my parents had saved for years to give me the wedding of my dreams. Each button she unfastened felt like shedding skin. By the time I stood in just my slip, I felt raw and exposed in a way that had nothing to do with clothing. I borrowed Lauren's sweats and spent the night on her couch, staring at the ceiling while she slept in the next room. My phone buzzed constantly with messages I couldn't bring myself to read. Apologies from guests. Furious texts from friends who'd heard what happened. Nothing from Trevor or Penelope. The next morning brought the cruel clarity that only sleep deprivation and shock can provide. I had to face the practical devastation of my imploded life. The wedding vendors were the first nightmare. The florist, the caterer, the photographer, the reception venue, all paid for, all non-refundable. My parents had spent over $40,000 on a wedding that never happened. The honeymoon tickets to Santorini, another $5,000, completely wasted. Then there was the apartment Trevor and I had leased together, starting July 1st. We'd signed a year-long contract, both of our names on it. The furniture we'd already purchased and moved in. The joint bank account we'd opened for wedding gifts and household expenses. The teaching position at Millbrook Elementary suddenly felt impossible. How could I face the staff room knowing everyone had witnessed my humiliation? How could I walk through town without seeing pity in every familiar face? But the worst part, the part that hollowed me out from the inside, was the social aftermath. Within days, I discovered that Millbrook's sympathies were complicated. Some friends rallied around me with fierce loyalty. But others, shockingly, seemed to view the situation as somehow romantic. They couldn't help falling in love, I overheard someone say at the grocery store. It's tragic, but at least they were honest about their feelings before Natalie married the wrong person. Honest? They'd waited until 200 people were seated in a chapel. Until I was dressed and ready to walk down the aisle. That wasn't honesty, it was cruelty disguised as inevitability. Penelope's mother, my Aunt Diane, called me 3 days after the wedding that wasn't. I'd expected an apology, maybe even some accountability. Instead, she'd asked me to try to understand that Penelope had been through so much with her divorce and deserved happiness. What about Natalie's happiness? My mother had shouted in the background before snatching the phone and ending the call with language I'd never heard her use. But the damage was done. My extended family was fracturing along fault lines of loyalty and judgment. Thanksgiving and Christmas suddenly loomed as potential battlegrounds. The family dynamics I'd known my entire life were irreparably altered. 2 weeks after the incident, Trevor's mother reached out. Margaret Castellan had always treated me like a daughter, and her call gave me a flicker of hope that someone from his family might acknowledge the cruelty of what he'd done. "Natalie, dear," she'd said, her voice warm but careful. "I'm so sorry for how things unfolded. Trevor handled it terribly." "Thank you," I'd whispered, relief flooding through me. "But I hope you can understand," she continued, and my stomach dropped. When two people have a real connection, sometimes timing is just unfortunate. Penelope makes Trevor happy in a way I haven't seen before. I hope someday you can be happy for them. I'd hung up without responding. The isolation intensified. Friends who'd been close to both Trevor and me suddenly became awkward, unsure whose side to take. Dinner invitations dried up. Group chats went quiet. I'd become the embodying of everyone's worst nightmare, the jilted bride, the woman who wasn't enough to keep her man, the walking reminder that love can betray you at the altar. My parents tried everything to lift my spirits. My mother cooked my favorite meals that I couldn't eat. My father suggested a family trip somewhere far from Millbrook. My younger brother Daniel threatened to find Trevor and knock some sense into him, which would have been touching if Daniel wasn't a 140-pound graphic designer with no fighting experience. But their concern, while appreciated, felt suffocating. Every pitying glance reminded me of my failure. Every careful word underscored my humiliation. The financial reality became clearer as I sorted through the wreckage. The wedding expenses were just the beginning. Trevor and I had been splitting rent on our old apartment until the wedding. Now I'd need to find a place I could afford on just my teaching salary. The furniture we'd bought together would need to be divided, negotiated, dealt with. And then there was the matter of the school year starting in 2 months. I couldn't do it. I couldn't walk into Millbrook Elementary and face the knowing looks, the whispered gossip, the carefully neutral expressions of colleagues who'd all been invited to my wedding. I couldn't build a life in this town where everywhere I looked, I'd see ghosts of the future I'd planned. 6 weeks after the wedding disaster, I submitted my resignation to the school district. My principal, a kind woman named Ruth Harrison, had tried to talk me out of it. "Natalie, don't let them chase you away from your career," she'd said gently. "You're an excellent teacher. The children adore you." But it wasn't about them chasing me away. It was about survival. About needing to breathe without the weight of everyone's opinions pressing down on my chest. With no job, no wedding, no fiancé, and no viable future in Millbrook, I packed my life into a U-Haul with Lauren's help. My childhood bedroom suddenly became my permanent residence again at age 28, surrounded by high school yearbooks and faded posters, a regression that felt like drowning. The nights were the worst. Alone in the dark, my mind would replay every moment, searching for the exact point where I'd lost Trevor. Had it been gradual? Sudden? Had there been a specific conversation, a look, a touch between him and Penelope that had started it all? I tortured myself with questions that had no satisfying answers. 3 months after the wedding, I was still sleeping until noon, still avoiding social media where I'd inevitably see updates about Trevor and Penelope's new life together, still jumping at every knock on the door in case it was someone wanting to offer hollow condolences. My savings account, once healthy from combined teacher salaries and wedding gift money I'd have to return, dwindled as I paid my share of the apartment lease Trevor and I had signed. He'd offered to handle everything, which really meant leaving me legally responsible while he started fresh with Penelope somewhere new. I later learned through the small-town gossip network that they'd moved to Greenville, South Carolina, just far enough away to avoid constant run-ins with their betrayal, but close enough that mutual friends kept me informed whether I wanted to know or not. They were living together. Penelope had gotten a job at a marketing firm. Trevor was teaching at a private school. They looked happy in the photos people felt compelled to show me, as if their happiness somehow justified the devastation they'd left in their wake. On what would have been my 4-month wedding anniversary, I hit absolute rock bottom. I spent the entire day in bed, unable to summon the energy even to shower. My mother brought me soup I didn't eat. My father suggested therapy I wasn't ready for. That night, I stood in front of my childhood mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in months. The woman staring back was almost unrecognizable. Hollow-eyed, 20 pounds lighter, wearing a ratty college sweatshirt and sweatpants that hung off my frame. My hair, which I'd once kept carefully styled, was pulled back in a messy knot. I looked defeated. And in that moment of brutal clarity, I realized something that would change everything. This version of myself, broken, bitter, stuck in my childhood bedroom at 28, waiting for Trevor and Penelope to feel guilty enough to apologize, was exactly what they probably expected. The thought ignited something I hadn't felt in months. Not quite anger, not quite determination, but something in between. A tiny spark of defiance that whispered, what if you became someone they never expected? What if you built a life so extraordinary that their betrayal became the best thing that ever happened to you? It was barely a flicker, easily extinguished. But it was there. And for the first time since that devastating June afternoon, I felt something other than despair. I felt possibility. The morning after my rock-bottom realization, I woke up before my alarm for the first time in months. The spark from the night before hadn't extinguished during sleep. If anything, it had grown into something more substantial. Not quite a plan, but the skeleton of one. I made coffee and sat at my childhood desk, pulling out a notebook I hadn't touched since college. On the first blank page, I wrote a single question: what would the best version of my life look like? For an hour, I stared at that question, pen hovering over paper. The truth was, I didn't know anymore. Every dream I'd had for the past 5 years had included Trevor. Our classroom across the hall from each other. Our house in the mountains. Our eventual children. Every vision of my future had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. So I needed new dreams. Dreams that belonged only to me. The first item I wrote surprised me: leave Millbrook. I'd lived in this town my entire life. My parents were here, my friends, my roots. But those roots had become chains. Every street corner held a memory I needed to escape. Every familiar face carried judgment or pity. If I was going to rebuild, I needed distance from the wreckage. The second item came easier: find work that excites me, not just pays bills. Teaching had been a compromise, if I was honest with myself. I'd loved children, yes, but I'd chosen elementary education partly because Trevor was choosing it, and partly because it seemed safe and respectable. But what had I actually loved before I'd started shaping my dreams around someone else's? I thought back to college, before Trevor had dominated my world. I'd been an English major with a minor in art history. I'd spent every spare hour at the university gallery, volunteering at exhibition openings, writing art criticism for the student paper. I'd dreamed, briefly, of working in a museum or gallery. But those dreams had seemed impractical, childish. Trevor had convinced me that teaching was more stable, more reliable. And I'd listened, adjusting my trajectory to match his. What if I'd been wrong to give up so easily? I opened my laptop, a small miracle that I was even motivated enough to boot it up, and started searching. Museum jobs in cities far from North Carolina. Gallery positions. Arts administration roles. Most required experience I didn't have, but one posting caught my eye. Gallery coordinator needed for Hartley Arts Foundation, Charleston, South Carolina. Entry-level position assisting with exhibition planning, donor relations, and educational programming. Art history background preferred. Enthusiasm for contemporary art essential. Charleston. I'd visited once during college, charmed by its historic architecture and vibrant art scene. It was far enough from Millbrook to feel like a genuine escape, but close enough that I could visit my parents when needed. And South Carolina, I'd be in the same state as Trevor and Penelope's new life in Greenville, but 5 hours away. Separate enough that I'd never have to worry about running into them at the grocery store. The position paid barely enough to live on, but it wasn't about the money. It was about becoming someone new. Someone Trevor wouldn't recognize. I spent the rest of that day crafting a cover letter, pouring every ounce of my rekindled passion into explaining why I wanted this opportunity. I attached my resume, sparse as it was, and hit send before I could second-guess myself. The response came faster than I expected. 3 days later, the foundation's director, a woman named Judith Pemberton, called to schedule a phone interview. Her voice was warm but professional, and she asked questions that required me to reach deep into memories of gallery visits and exhibition reviews I'd written years ago. "I see you've been teaching elementary school," Judith noted. This would be quite a career change. It would, I agreed, deciding honesty was the only viable strategy. I became a teacher because it seemed like the practical choice. But I've realized that practical doesn't always mean right. I want to work in a field I'm genuinely passionate about, even if it means starting over. There was a pause. Then, "Can you come to Charleston for an in-person interview next week?" I could barely afford the gas money for the 6-hour drive, but I didn't hesitate. Yes. My parents were cautiously supportive when I told them. My mother worried about me moving so far away while I was still fragile, her word, not mine. My father worried about the financial instability of a nonprofit arts job. But they could see something had shifted in me, some internal pilot light had reignited, and they were wise enough not to extinguish it with practical objections. Lauren was thrilled. "About damn time," she said when I called to tell her. "You've been in limbo long enough. Go build something beautiful. The drive to Charleston was therapeutic. With each mile marker I passed, I felt the weight of Millbrook lifting. The Blue Ridge Mountains gave way to rolling Piedmont hills, then to the flat coastal plains of the Lowcountry. By the time I crossed into Charleston proper, with its church steeples and rainbow row houses, I felt like I could breathe fully for the first time in months. The Hartley Arts Foundation occupied a renovated warehouse in the French Quarter, all exposed brick and soaring ceilings flooded with natural light. The current exhibition featured large-scale abstract paintings that seemed to pulse with energy. I stood in the gallery for 15 minutes before my interview, absorbing the space, imagining myself working here. Judith Pemberton was in her late 50s, silver hair cut in a sharp bob, wearing flowing linen pants and statement jewelry that somehow looked both artistic and authoritative. She walked me through the Foundation's mission, supporting emerging contemporary artists through exhibitions, grants, and educational programming, and I felt my enthusiasm building with each description. The coordinator role is demanding, she warned. Long hours during exhibition installations. Weekend events. Donor cultivation that requires significant charm and patience. And the pay, I won't sugarcoat it, is modest at best. I understand, I said. But I'd rather struggle financially doing work that matters to me than be comfortable doing something that leaves me hollow. Judith's expression softened. You've been through something difficult recently, haven't you? The observation caught me off guard. What makes you say that? 20 years in this field teaches you to read people. You have the look of someone who's rebuilding from scratch. There's a hunger there, a determination that goes beyond normal job seeking. I considered lying, maintaining professional distance. But something about Judith's directness invited honesty. My fiancé left me at the altar for my cousin 4 months ago, I said simply. I quit my teaching job, moved back in with my parents, and spent 3 months feeling sorry for myself. This interview is part of me deciding to become someone neither he nor I ever expected. Judith nodded slowly. Good. The best art comes from transformation. So does the best art advocacy. She stood, extending her hand. When can you start? The offer was so unexpected I almost laughed. You're hiring me? I'm hiring your hunger, she corrected. Your credentials are adequate, but what I really need is someone who will pour themselves into this work because they need it as much as it needs them. Sound like you? It sounded exactly like me. 2 weeks later, I packed everything I owned into a rented moving truck, a depressingly small load after sorting through what had been ours versus what was just mine. My parents helped me load furniture, both of them crying as I prepared to leave. You call us every week, my mother insisted, gripping my hands. And if that city doesn't treat you right, you come straight home. I will, I promised, though we both knew I wouldn't. This wasn't a temporary escape, it was a permanent exodus. The apartment I'd found was a tiny one-bedroom in a converted house on the outskirts of downtown Charleston. The neighborhood was transitional, polite real estate speak for slightly sketchy, but the rent was manageable on my new salary, and it had original hardwood floors and tall windows that let in abundant light. More importantly, it was mine. No shared lease with a faithless fiancé. No memories embedded in the walls. Just blank space waiting to be filled with a new life. My first day at the Hartley Foundation was overwhelming in the best possible way. Judith threw me directly into preparations for an upcoming exhibition opening, giving me a crash course in everything from hanging artwork to managing catering vendors to schmoozing potential donors. You'll learn by doing, she said, handing me a clipboard with a contact list of Charleston's art patrons. These people have money and varying degrees of genuine interest in contemporary art. Your job is to make them feel cultured and generous enough to write checks. I'd never been good at asking people for money, but I discovered I could talk passionately about art and artists in a way that made donors want to support the work. My background in art criticism, dormant for years, came flooding back. I could contextualize a painting within art historical movements, explain an artist's technique, articulate why a particular piece mattered. The exhibition opening 2 weeks after I started was a revelation. The gallery filled with Charleston's cultural elite, old money families in understated expensive clothing, young professionals trying to seem sophisticated, serious collectors evaluating investments. I moved through the crowd with champagne flutes and artist statements, facilitating conversations, making connections. And for the first time in months, I felt competent. Capable. Like I was building something that belonged entirely to me. After the opening, as we cleaned up discarded wine glasses and straightened chairs, Judith pulled me aside. "You're a natural at this. Where have you been hiding?" "Millbrook, North Carolina," I said. "Teaching phonics to second graders and planning a wedding that never happened." She laughed. "Well, their loss is Charleston's gain." Over the following months, I threw myself into work with single-minded intensity. 60-hour weeks became normal. I volunteered for every project, every event, every opportunity to learn. When Judith mentioned the foundation was developing a new public art initiative, I researched similar programs in other cities and presented her with a detailed proposal. When we needed better social media presence, I taught myself Instagram strategy and grew our following by 300% in 2 months. I was running, not from something anymore, but toward it. Toward competence, expertise, a professional identity completely separate from being someone's abandoned fiancé. My personal life remained sparse. I made a few friends among Charleston's arts community, but kept them at arm's length. Dating seemed impossible. I couldn't imagine trusting anyone enough to be vulnerable again. My apartment remained sparsely furnished, more functional than homey, because investing in comfort felt like admitting I'd be here long enough to need it. But 6 months into my new life, something unexpected happened. The foundation hosted a donor appreciation gala at a historic mansion on the Battery. I was managing logistics, seating charts, catering coordination, making sure VIP donors felt sufficiently appreciated. Judith had mentioned a new board member would be attending, someone who'd recently made a substantial contribution, but I'd been too busy with details to pay attention to the name. I was troubleshooting a problem with the caterer when Judith touched my arm. "Natalie, I want you to meet someone. This is Dominic Ashford, our newest board member and the reason we were able to fund the public art initiative you proposed." I turned, polite smile already in place, and found myself looking up at possibly the most striking man I'd ever seen in person. Tall, probably 6'3", with dark hair touched with silver at the temples despite appearing to be only in his mid-30s. Impeccably tailored charcoal suit. Intelligent gray eyes that seemed to assess and appreciate simultaneously. And a smile that suggested he was genuinely interested in whatever was about to happen next. "Dominic Ashford-Monroe, actually," he said, extending his hand. "The hyphenation is a recent addition, long story involving family trusts and my mother's insistence on preserving her maiden name. But please, call me Dominic." His handshake was firm and warm. "Natalie Monroe," I replied, then caught the coincidence. Also a Monroe. Though no family trusts involved in my case. "Ah, but the best Monroes earn rather than inherit," he said, and I couldn't tell if he was teasing or serious. "Judith tells me the public art proposal was your work." "Brilliant strategy, using neighborhood partnerships to expand our reach beyond traditional gallery spaces." I'd expected a wealthy board member to be either condescending or disinterested. Dominic was neither. For the next 20 minutes, as the gala swirled around us, we discussed public art initiatives in other cities, the challenges of making contemporary art accessible, and the importance of arts education. He was knowledgeable without being pretentious, wealthy without being ostentatious, and, most surprisingly, genuinely interested in my opinions despite the vast difference in our professional positions and bank accounts. When Judith finally pulled him away to introduce him to other donors, he paused. "I'd like to continue this conversation. Would you have coffee with me sometime?" Every instinct screamed to decline. I wasn't ready. I couldn't trust. But there was something in his directness, his apparent sincerity, that made me hesitate. "Coffee," I agreed carefully. As colleagues discussing the public art initiative. His smile suggested he understood exactly what I was doing, maintaining professional distance as armor. "Of course. Though I should warn you, I make excellent conversation over coffee. You might actually enjoy it." 3 days later, we met at a small cafe in the French Quarter. What was supposed to be a 1-hour professional discussion stretched into 3 hours of wide-ranging conversation. Art, yes, but also books, travel, childhood stories, dreams deferred and dreams pursued. Dominic, I learned, came from Charleston old money. His family had owned shipping companies and rice plantations generations back, though he'd built his own wealth in sustainable development and green technology. He'd recently returned to Charleston after years in New York and San Francisco, drawn back by family obligations and a desire to invest in his hometown's cultural infrastructure. He asked about my background, and I gave him the edited version. Former teacher, recent transplant from North Carolina, passionate about arts advocacy. I didn't mention Trevor or Penelope or the spectacular public humiliation that had catalyzed my reinvention. As weeks passed, coffee became dinner. Dinner became gallery openings attended together. I remained cautious, maintaining careful boundaries, but Dominic was patient in a way that felt genuine rather than strategic. He never pushed, never presumed, never made me feel like a conquest or a project. He simply showed up, consistently and kindly, until showing up together became the most natural thing in the world. And slowly, carefully, I began to believe that maybe I could trust again. That maybe the spark I'd felt that night in my childhood bedroom was growing into something sustainable. That maybe becoming someone Trevor wouldn't recognize was just the beginning of becoming someone I'd always been meant to be. 1 year into my Charleston life, everything had shifted in ways I couldn't have predicted. The Hartley Arts Foundation had promoted me to Associate Director of Programming, a title that came with real responsibility and a salary that finally allowed me to move from my sketchy neighborhood apartment to a charming 2-bedroom in Harleston Village. The promotion happened after I successfully launched the public art initiative Dominic had funded. We'd installed 6 large-scale sculptures throughout Charleston's underserved neighborhoods, each paired with educational programming in local schools. The project received regional press coverage and attracted additional donors who saw the foundation as innovative rather than traditional. Judith had called me into her office on a humid August afternoon, ceiling fan barely moving the thick air. The board voted unanimously, she said, sliding a new contract across her desk. You've earned this, Natalie. You've transformed how this foundation engages with the community. The recognition felt surreal. A year and a half ago, I'd been sleeping until noon in my childhood bedroom, convinced my life was effectively over. Now I was being promoted at an organization I deeply believed in, living independently in a beautiful city, building a professional reputation entirely separate from anyone else's shadow. But the most unexpected transformation was happening in my personal life. Dominic and I had been dating officially for 8 months, though the transition from colleagues to something more had been so gradual I couldn't pinpoint an exact moment. There'd been no dramatic declaration, no defining first kiss. Instead, our relationship had unfolded like a slow-developing photograph, details emerging gradually until suddenly the full picture was undeniable. He was unlike anyone I'd ever dated. Where Trevor had been charming but ultimately self-serving, Dominic was genuinely thoughtful. He remembered small details, that I preferred tea to coffee in the mornings, that I loved old bookstores but hated crowds, that I needed silence to recharge after big social events. More importantly, he encouraged my independence rather than trying to reshape me. When I mentioned wanting to take an art conservation course, he'd found the best program in the region and offered to cover the tuition as an investment in the foundation's future capabilities. When I got overwhelmed with work, he'd show up with takeout and help me organize spreadsheets rather than complaining about my lack of availability. You're building something important, he'd say. I'm just here to support that however I can. It was so different from Trevor's subtle demands that I prioritize his needs, his career, his vision of our future. With Dominic, I never felt diminished. If anything, I felt amplified. My parents had met him during their visit to Charleston in the spring. My mother had been predictably cautious, once burned, twice shy, but my father had pulled me aside after dinner. He's solid, Natalie, Dad had said quietly. The real thing. Nothing like that Trevor character. Even Lauren, who'd driven down for a long weekend visit, had given her approval. He looks at you like you hung the moon, she'd observed. But more importantly, he talks to you like you're an equal. That's the difference. Still, I maintained careful boundaries. I hadn't told Dominic the full story of what had happened with Trevor and Penelope. He knew I'd left North Carolina after a difficult breakup, but I'd kept the humiliating details, the wedding day abandonment, the cousin betrayal, carefully hidden. Some wounds were too private to expose, even to someone as understanding as Dominic seemed to be. The Foundation's fall fundraising gala was our biggest event of the year, crucial for securing operating budget for the next 12 months. As associate director, I was managing every aspect: venue selection, donor cultivation, program development, silent auction procurement. The pressure was intense but energizing. I'd assembled a team of volunteers, created detailed timelines, and personally reached out to every major donor in our database. This gala would prove whether my promotion had been deserved or premature. 3 weeks before the event, Judith dropped unexpected news. "The Pemberton family has decided to make a transformational gift," she said, barely containing her excitement. $2 million to establish an endowment for emerging artist grants. $2 million. It would fundamentally change what the foundation could accomplish, providing sustainable funding rather than the year-to-year scramble we'd been operating under. "There's one condition," Judith continued. "They want the announcement made at the gala, and they want you to present it. You've impressed them with the public art initiative and the community partnerships. They see you as the foundation's future." The responsibility was staggering. I'd be presenting to Charleston's cultural elite, major donors, and press, establishing myself as a serious player in the city's arts infrastructure. This wasn't supporting someone else's vision anymore, this was leading. I threw myself into preparation with obsessive focus. Rehearsing my remarks, coordinating with the Pemberton family about announcement timing, ensuring every logistical detail was flawless. Dominic would arrive at my apartment to find me surrounded by seating charts and donor notes, barely aware of what day it was. "You're going to be brilliant," he'd assure me, but I couldn't shake the anxiety that I'd somehow fail spectacularly, proving I'd been promoted beyond my capabilities. The week before the gala, my mother called with news I'd been half expecting but dreading. "I ran into your Aunt Diane at the grocery store," she said carefully. She mentioned that Trevor and Penelope got engaged. The information landed with less impact than I'd expected. A year ago, it would have devastated me. 6 months ago, it would have stung. Now, it just felt like information about strangers. "Good for them," I said, and meant it. Not because I'd forgiven them, I wasn't sure I ever would, but because their story had ceased to be relevant to mine. "That's all you're going to say?" my mother pressed, surprised by my lack of reaction. "What else is there? They've been living together for over a year. Marriage is the logical next step." I glanced at my gala timeline spreadsheet. "Mom, I have to go. I'm presenting a major announcement at our fundraiser this weekend, and I need to finish prep work." After we hung up, I sat with the news for a moment, examining my feelings the way you'd probe a tooth that had once ached. There was no pain, no anger, not even satisfaction that they were taking a step we'd never reached. Just neutrality. Trevor and Penelope's engagement didn't matter because Trevor and Penelope didn't matter. They'd become characters in a story I no longer identified with: the abandoned bride, the humiliated teacher, the woman whose life fell apart. That wasn't who I was anymore. I was Natalie Monroe, Associate Director of Programming at a respected arts foundation. I was the architect of a successful public art initiative. I was a professional whose opinions were valued and whose work made a tangible difference. And yes, I was someone dating a remarkable man who treated me as an equal partner. Their engagement didn't diminish any of that. If anything, it underscored how completely our paths had diverged. The night of the gala arrived with perfect autumn weather, cool enough to be comfortable, clear enough for the outdoor cocktail reception we'd planned at the historic William Aiken House. I'd spent the afternoon in professional panic mode, checking and rechecking every detail, until Dominic had physically removed the clipboard from my hands. "It's going to be perfect because you've made it perfect," he said firmly. "Now go home, take a bath, put on that stunning dress I know you bought for tonight, and remember that you've earned this moment." The dress was emerald silk, vintage Halston I'd found at an estate sale and had professionally altered. It was elegant without being ostentatious, the kind of understated luxury that signaled I belonged in these circles without trying too hard to prove it. When I arrived at the venue, the transformation took my breath away. The team had executed every detail perfectly, soft lighting highlighting the mansion's architectural features, bars strategically positioned for optimal flow, silent auction displays that showcased items without cluttering space. Guests began arriving at 7, Charleston's cultural establishment in all their refined glory. I moved through the crowd with practiced ease now, no longer intimidated by old money surnames or impressive resumes. These were my professional peers, my donors, my community. Dominic arrived fashionably late, devastating in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, and immediately found me in the crowd. "You look absolutely stunning," he said quietly. "And this event is extraordinary. You should be very proud." The evening flowed seamlessly, cocktails transitioning to dinner leading to the program segment where I'd make the major announcement. As I stood to approach the podium, I caught Judith's encouraging nod from across the room. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady despite nervous energy coursing through me. 2 years ago, I arrived in Charleston with little more than a suitcase and a passionate belief that art matters. That it has the power to transform communities, challenge perspectives, and create connections across every boundary that typically divides us. I outlined the Foundation's accomplishments over the past year, the public art initiative, the expanded education programming, the partnerships with schools and community centers. Then I paused, building anticipation. Tonight, I'm honored to announce a gift that will fundamentally transform what this foundation can accomplish. The Pemberton family has committed $2 million to establish an endowment for emerging artist grants, ensuring that for generations to come, talented artists will have the support they need to develop their work and contribute to Charleston's cultural vitality. The room erupted in applause. I saw several board members exchanging delighted glances, donors nodding approval, and Dominic watching me with an expression that made my heart skip. As I returned to my seat, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline, Judith leaned over. "You just secured this foundation's future. And established yourself as a force in this city. Well done, Natalie." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and networking. By the time the last guests departed near midnight, I was exhausted but exhilarated. We'd exceeded our fundraising goal by 30%. The announcement had generated immediate press interest. And I'd proven, to the board, to donors, and most importantly to myself, that I belonged in this role. Dominic insisted on walking me to my car despite my protests that I was perfectly capable of navigating the 3 blocks alone. In the quiet darkness of the historic district, Spanish moss swaying from live oak trees, he stopped and turned to face me. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "Not just for tonight, though tonight was remarkable. But for everything you've built here. You arrived in Charleston broken, and you've become extraordinary." The words, delivered with such sincerity, cracked something open in me. I wasn't just broken, I heard myself say. I was humiliated. My fiancé left me at the altar for my cousin. 200 people watched me get abandoned on what was supposed to be my wedding day. Dominic's expression didn't change to pity or shock. Instead, he nodded slowly. I wondered if it was something like that. The way you changed the subject whenever your past came up. The carefully maintained boundaries. And you stayed anyway? I asked, vulnerability making my voice small. Natalie, I didn't fall for who you were before Charleston. I fell for who you are now, the woman who turned catastrophic betrayal into catalyst for extraordinary growth. That takes remarkable strength. He reached for my hand. Though I confess, I've been wanting to find that fiancé and cousin of yours and explain in detail what idiots they were to let you go. I laughed despite the tears forming. They got engaged last week. Then they deserve each other, Dominic said firmly. And you deserve someone who recognizes your value. Standing there under Charleston's historic street lamps, Spanish moss casting shadows around us, I realized something fundamental had shifted. For months, I'd been building a new life while still defining myself partly in opposition to my old one, proving Trevor wrong, becoming someone he'd regret losing. But tonight, presenting that endowment announcement, I'd felt completely present in my own story. Not performing for an imagined audience of people from my past, but genuinely invested in my current work and future possibilities. Trevor and Penelope's engagement didn't hurt because I'd finally, fully moved on. Not just to a new city or new job, but to a new understanding of my own worth. I think I'm ready, I said quietly. Ready for what? To stop protecting myself quite so carefully. To trust that this, I gestured between us, is real and sustainable, not just another thing that will blow up in my face. Dominic smiled, and in the amber streetlight, I saw nothing but genuine affection. I can promise you I'm not going anywhere. Though fair warning, my mother is going to want to meet you officially now that you're Charleston Arts Establishment. She takes these things very seriously. How seriously? She's already asked if you'll be attending the Charleston Heritage Society's Winter Gala as my guest. Apparently, arriving without a proper partner reflects poorly on the family name. I should have been intimidated, meeting the family of Charleston Old Money Society. Instead, I felt ready. Not because I needed their approval, but because I was confident enough in my own standing to navigate their world as an equal. Tell your mother I'd be delighted to attend, I said. As long as she's prepared for a date who earned her position rather than inheriting it. She'll love you even more for that, Dominic assured me. My mother has very little patience for people who coast on family legacy without building something of their own. As we finally reached my car, Dominic kissed me goodnight, not our first kiss, but somehow the first one that felt completely unburdened by my past. When I drove home through Charleston's quiet streets, I wasn't thinking about Trevor or Penelope or wedding disasters. I was thinking about endowment strategies and upcoming exhibitions and the remarkable fact that I'd built a life I genuinely loved, brick by brick, choice by choice, entirely on my own terms. The woman Trevor had abandoned at the altar was gone. In her place was someone infinitely stronger, more capable, and more certain of her own value. And the best part? This transformation had nothing to do with him at all. 18 months into my Charleston renaissance, the inevitable happened. The past I'd carefully compartmentalized collided with the present I'd meticulously constructed. It started with a phone call from Lauren on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was at my desk reviewing grant applications when her name flashed on my screen. You need to sit down, she said without preamble. I'm already sitting. What's wrong? Trevor's mother called my mom last night. Apparently, Trevor and Penelope are getting married in June. And here's the thing, they're having the wedding in Charleston. My coffee cup paused halfway to my lips. Charleston? Why would they possibly choose Charleston? Penelope has some college friend who lives there, and apparently they've always loved the city. The wedding is at some plantation venue outside town. Your Aunt Diane is beside herself with excitement about the destination wedding. I set my coffee down carefully, processing this information. Charleston wasn't a small town. I could easily avoid a wedding happening somewhere in the greater metro area. But the coincidence felt like the universe testing my hard-won equilibrium. When in June? I asked. June 22nd. Natalie, I know you've moved on, but are you okay with this? Was I okay with it? I examined my feelings with the same clinical distance I'd apply to evaluating an artist's portfolio. Surprise, yes. Mild annoyance at the geographic coincidence. But genuine distress? No. I'm fine, I said, and realized I meant it. Charleston's my city now, not theirs. They're just tourists passing through for a weekend. After hanging up, I mentioned it to Judith during our weekly planning meeting. She'd become not just a boss but a mentor and friend, and I'd gradually shared more of my history with her. How do you feel about them invading your territory? She asked, her directness as refreshing as always. Like they're irrelevant to my actual life, I said. Though I'll probably avoid downtown that weekend just to eliminate any chance of an awkward encounter. What I didn't anticipate was how small Charleston's social circles actually were, especially among certain demographics. 2 weeks after Lauren's call, Dominic and I were having dinner at his family's historic home on Trad Street, a weekly tradition his mother had insisted upon once we'd been dating for a year. Constance Ashford-Monroe was formidable in the way only Charleston old money matriarchs can be, but she'd accepted me with surprising warmth once she'd confirmed I was building my own career rather than hunting for a wealthy husband. "Dominic, darling," Constance said over the first course, "I ran into Bitsy Whitmore at the Garden Club luncheon today. She mentioned her daughter Harper is hosting a friend's wedding at Magnolia Plantation in June. Harper apparently befriended the bride during their sorority days at University of South Carolina." I felt Dominic's attention shift toward me, but I kept my expression neutral. "The bride is from North Carolina, recently moved to Greenville," Constance continued. "Marrying her childhood sweetheart after some complicated history involving his previous engagement. You know how these small-town dramas unfold." The bread I was chewing suddenly tasted like sawdust. Harper Whitmore was hosting Penelope's wedding. And the Whitmores moved in exactly the same social circles as the Ashford-Monroes. "How interesting," I managed, reaching for my water glass. Dominic's hand found mine under the table, a silent question and offer of support. "Mother," he said carefully, "the bride wouldn't happen to be named Penelope, would she?" Constance's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "Why yes, Penelope Hartford. Do you know her?" "No, but Natalie does." Penelope is the cousin who ran off with Natalie's fiancé on what was supposed to be Natalie's wedding day. The silence that followed was profound. Constance's fork paused halfway to her mouth, her expression shifting from polite interest to something sharper. "The cousin who," she set her fork down with deliberate precision. "That Penelope?" "The very same," I confirmed, finding my voice. Though to be fair, it was nearly 2 years ago. They're entitled to get married wherever they choose. Constance's eyes, the same gray as Dominic's, assessed me with new intensity. "Harper asked if we'd attend the wedding as her family's representative since her parents will be traveling in Europe. I was planning to RSVP yes as a courtesy to the Whitmores." The implication hung in the air. If the Ashford-Monroes attended Penelope's wedding, I'd be tangentially connected to the event through Dominic's family obligations. "You should absolutely attend if it's a social expectation," I said firmly. "This isn't your drama to navigate, and I wouldn't want to create awkwardness with the Whitmores." "Alternatively," Dominic interjected, "we could all decline and I could take Natalie to our place in Kiowa that weekend. The house has been sitting empty too long anyway." Constance studied us both, and I could practically see her calculating the social mathematics. Then she smiled, and it was surprisingly warm. "Or," she said slowly, "we could attend together. All 3 of us. After all, if this woman had the audacity to steal your fiancé and then host her wedding in your city, the least we can do is remind her that you've done rather well for yourself in the interim." My mouth fell open slightly. "You're suggesting we crash my cousin's wedding?" "Not crash, we'd be invited guests attending at the Whitmore family's request. There's a significant difference." Constance's smile turned calculating. "Though I confess, I'd find it deeply satisfying to watch this Penelope person's reaction when she realizes you're dating my son." "Mother, Natalie isn't a prop for your entertainment," Dominic said, but his tone was gentle, almost amused. "Of course not. But she also shouldn't have to hide in her own city because 2 people who treated her abominably are having a party." Constance turned to me. "What do you think, dear? Would you prefer we attend or decline?" The question forced me to examine what I actually wanted. Part of me wanted to avoid the entire situation. Why court potential drama when I could easily be elsewhere? But another part, the part that had rebuilt herself from humiliation, bristled at the idea of hiding. "I think," I said slowly, "that I'd like to attend. Not for revenge or to prove anything, but because Constance is right. I shouldn't have to avoid social events in my own city because Trevor and Penelope might be uncomfortable." Dominic squeezed my hand. "Are you sure? There's no pressure either way." "I'm sure. Besides, I'm curious to see who they've become. It's been almost 2 years, maybe they've grown into better people." I didn't entirely believe this, but it sounded mature and measured. The following weeks passed in their usual rhythm of work and planning. The Foundation's spring exhibition was consuming most of my attention, a showcase of Southern contemporary artists that had required months of coordination. I'd personally worked with each artist on installation, building relationships that went beyond the typical curator-artist dynamic. The show opened to critical acclaim and strong attendance. A review in the regional arts magazine specifically praised the Foundation's programming vision under my leadership. Judith framed the review and hung it in our office hallway. "You've arrived," she said simply. "This is the kind of recognition that establishes careers." The success felt hard-earned and deeply satisfying. I was building something real, something that would outlast any individual relationship or personal drama. As June approached, I'd largely stopped thinking about the wedding except in logistical terms: what to wear, whether to bring a gift, how long we'd need to stay to fulfill social obligations. It had become just another event on my calendar, remarkable only for its peripheral connection to my past. Then, a week before the wedding, everything shifted. I was leaving the Foundation late on a Thursday evening when I nearly collided with someone entering the building. I looked up to apologize and found myself face to face with Trevor. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked older, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago, his hair slightly longer than he used to wear it. But fundamentally the same: khaki pants, button-down shirt, safe and predictable. "Natalie," he finally said, my name sounding strange in his familiar voice. "I didn't know you worked here." "Associate Director of Programming," I replied automatically, then cursed myself for sounding like I was justifying my presence in my own workplace. "Are you here for the exhibition?" "Yeah, Penelope wanted to see it before the wedding." "She's parking the car." He shifted uncomfortably. "We're in town early for wedding prep stuff." The information that Penelope was about to appear created instant urgency. "The exhibition is excellent. Enjoy it." I moved to step around him. "Wait," Trevor said, his hand hovering near my arm without quite touching. "Can we talk? Just for a minute?" Every instinct screamed to decline and leave, but curiosity won. "1 minute." He glanced toward the door, then back to me. "I know this is awkward, but I wanted to say, I'm sorry. For how everything happened. You didn't deserve that." The apology I'd once craved so desperately now felt 2 years too late and wholly inadequate. "You're right, I didn't deserve it. But it happened, and I've moved on." "I can see that." He gestured vaguely at the building. "This place, this job, it suits you better than teaching ever did. You seem different." "I am different." Betrayal has a way of clarifying priorities. Trevor flinched at the word betrayal. "It wasn't meant to hurt you. We just fell in love." "On my wedding day," I interrupted, my voice harder than intended. "You fell in love on my wedding day, Trevor. Let's not rewrite history to make it more palatable." Before he could respond, the door opened and Penelope walked in. She stopped short when she saw us, her expression cycling rapidly through surprise, discomfort, and something that might have been guilt. "Natalie," she said, her voice higher than I remembered. "Hi. Penelope. Congratulations on your wedding." She clutched her purse strap like a lifeline. "Thank you. We're so excited. Charleston is beautiful, I can see why you moved here." The casual acknowledgement that she'd known I lived in Charleston, that they'd chosen my city anyway, rankled. But I kept my expression neutral. "It's a wonderful place to build a life," I agreed. "I hope you enjoy the exhibition." I moved toward the door, eager to end this encounter, but Penelope's voice stopped me. "Natalie, I know we haven't talked since everything happened. But I want you to know I never meant to hurt you. It just happened, and we couldn't fight it." The passive voice construction, "it just happened," absolved them of any agency or responsibility. As if they'd been swept away by forces beyond their control rather than making repeated choices to betray someone who loved them both. "Nothing just happens," I said quietly. "People make choices. You both made yours, and I've made mine. I hope you're happy together." I walked out before either could respond, my heart pounding but my head clear. The encounter I'd dreaded had happened, and I'd survived it with dignity intact. When I reached my car, I sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, processing. Seeing Trevor again had confirmed what I'd suspected. Whatever I'd felt for him was completely gone. He seemed smaller somehow, diminished not by any change in him but by my expanded perspective. I called Dominic as I drove home. I just ran into Trevor and Penelope at the foundation. "Are you okay?" His immediate concern was reassuring. "I'm fine. Actually, I'm better than fine." They apologized, sort of, and I realized I don't care anymore. Not about the apology, not about their explanations. They're just people I used to know. "That's growth," Dominic said warmly. "Though it probably means Saturday's wedding will be anticlimactic now that you've already faced the confrontation. Maybe. Or maybe it'll be satisfying in a different way, showing up as someone completely transformed rather than the broken woman they left behind." Saturday arrived with perfect June weather, warm but not oppressive. I dressed carefully in a flowing lavender dress that struck the right balance between elegant and understated, wedding appropriate but not trying too hard. Dominic looked devastating in a light gray suit, and Constance was resplendent in pale blue silk. We made an impressive trio as we arrived at Magnolia Plantation, where Spanish moss draped from ancient oaks and the Ashley River provided a stunning backdrop. The ceremony was scheduled for 5 o'clock in the plantation's garden, with a reception to follow in the former carriage house. As we found our seats among the Whitmore family section, I spotted relatives from Millbrook, my Aunt Diane looking proud, cousins I hadn't seen since the wedding that wasn't. Several did double takes when they saw me, clearly not expecting my presence and certainly not expecting me to arrive with people who were obviously significant. The ceremony began with a string quartet playing. Penelope appeared at the garden entrance in a flowing white gown, my Aunt Diane crying happy tears beside the aisle. And then I saw Trevor, standing at the altar in a navy suit, looking both nervous and elated. As they exchanged vows, promises to love and cherish, to stay faithful through all of life's challenges, I felt only distant observation. These were strangers making promises I no longer cared whether they kept. When the minister pronounced them married and they kissed to applause, I clapped politely along with everyone else, feeling nothing but mild relief that the ceremony was over. The reception began with cocktails on the lawn. Dominic stayed close, his hand resting lightly on my back, a subtle claim and offer of support. Constance worked the crowd with practiced social grace, and I noticed several Millbrook relatives watching us with undisguised curiosity. Then the moment arrived that would transform the entire evening. Trevor and Penelope were making their rounds, greeting guests at each table. As they approached our section, Penelope's smile froze when she saw me properly for the first time, not in work clothes at the foundation, but dressed for a wedding, with Dominic beside me and Constance on my other side. Trevor's champagne glass, which he'd just raised for a toast, slipped from his fingers. It didn't shatter, the grass was soft, but champagne splashed across his shoes as he stared at Dominic with unmistakable recognition. "Is that," he started, his voice strangled. "Dominic Ashford," Penelope whispered, her face going pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. And that's when I realized they knew exactly who Dominic was. Not just as my boyfriend, but as a name that carried weight in Charleston and beyond. Old money, successful business ventures, prominent family name. Dominic stood and extended his hand with easy confidence, completely unaware of the bomb he was about to drop. Dominic Ashford-Monroe. Natalie took my name when we married last spring. And you must be the groom from that unfortunate incident several years back. What was it, 5 years ago now? The lie was so smooth, so casually delivered, that even I almost believed it for a second. But Dominic's slight squeeze of my hand told me this was intentional, a gift, a power play, or perhaps both. Penelope's eyes darted between Dominic's watch, his perfectly tailored suit, and the understated wedding band he'd slipped on specifically for this moment. "You married Dominic Ashford," she whispered, as if saying it louder might shatter the illusion. I smiled, letting the moment breathe before correcting the record. But before I could speak, I caught Dominic's expression, asking permission to continue this performance, and made a split-second decision. "Actually," I said smoothly, "we've been meaning to thank you both." And that's when I decided to own this moment completely. Consequences be damned. The words hung in the air, and I watched the calculation happening behind Penelope's eyes. She was trying to determine if I was being sincere or sarcastic, whether this was genuine gratitude or a perfectly crafted insult disguised as grace. "Thank you," Trevor managed, his confusion evident. "If you hadn't run off together on what was supposed to be my wedding day, I never would have moved to Charleston," I continued, my voice warm and genuine. "And I certainly never would have met Dominic at the Meridian Foundation Gala where he was keynoting about sustainable development and arts funding." Constance, catching on to the performance, added smoothly, "The foundation has been fortunate to have Natalie's vision. Her public art initiative won the Regional Arts Council's Innovation Award last fall." I watched Penelope's expression shift as she processed this information, not just that I'd moved on, but that I'd moved up in ways she clearly hadn't anticipated. "That's wonderful," Penelope said, but her voice had gone tight. "We heard you were working at some gallery." "The Hartley Arts Foundation," I corrected gently. "I'm the Associate Director of Programming. We just secured a $2 million endowment for emerging artist grants." Trevor's face had taken on a peculiar expression, somewhere between shock and something that looked uncomfortably like regret. He glanced at Penelope, then back at me, clearly recalibrating his understanding of the past 2 years. "I didn't realize you'd done so well," he said, and there was an edge to his voice I couldn't quite identify. Dominic's arms slid around my waist with easy possession. "Natalie's extraordinary at what she does. Though I'm biased, I knew she was remarkable the moment we met. Something about the way she discussed contemporary art's role in community development just captivated me completely. The performance was so smooth, so utterly convincing, that I almost forgot we weren't actually married." The wedding band Dominic wore, borrowed from his late grandfather for this specific purpose, caught the light as he lifted his champagne glass in a toast. "To new beginnings," Dominic said, his gray eyes warm as they met mine. "And to the unexpected blessings that come from life's hardest moments." We clinked glasses, and I saw my Aunt Diane approaching from across the lawn, her expression a mixture of surprise and barely concealed disapproval. She'd clearly heard enough of the conversation to realize I wasn't here as the pitiful abandoned niece she'd expected. "Natalie," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "What a surprise to see you here." "Mrs. Ashford-Monroe was kind enough to join us," Constance interjected with the kind of gracious authority that only Charleston old money can project. "Natalie mentioned she had family connections to the bride, and of course we wanted to support the Whitmore's event." The use of Mrs. Ashford-Monroe was deliberate and devastating. I caught the way my Aunt Diane's eyes widened slightly, reassessing everything she'd assumed about my post-wedding collapse. "Mrs. Ashford-Monroe," my aunt repeated slowly. "I hadn't realized you'd remarried." "Last spring," I confirmed, and the lie rolled off my tongue with surprising ease. "It was a small ceremony, just close friends and family. We didn't want a big production." The implicit contrast to the elaborate wedding happening around us wasn't lost on anyone. Penelope's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "How lovely," my aunt managed. "I'm sure your parents were thrilled." "They adore Dominic," I said truthfully. My parents had met him multiple times and genuinely loved him, which made this performance feel less like a complete fabrication and more like an accelerated timeline. Over the next hour, word spread through the reception with the efficiency of wildfire. I could track the gossip's progress by the waves of stares and whispered conversations. Millbrook relatives who'd pitted me 2 years ago now approached with forced congratulations and transparent curiosity about my apparent transformation. My cousin James, who'd been one of Trevor's groomsmen at the wedding that wasn't, cornered me near the bar. "So you married Dominic Ashford? The Ashford family?" "The very same," I confirmed, accepting a glass of wine from the bartender. "That's quite a rebound," James said, and there was an edge of judgment in his tone. "Didn't waste much time, did you?" Dominic materialized beside me before I could respond. "Actually, Natalie and I didn't connect until she'd been in Charleston for over a year. She was focused entirely on building her career at the foundation. I had to be remarkably persistent before she'd even agree to coffee." The gentle correction, delivered without hostility, made James flush slightly. "Right, of course. I didn't mean to suggest." That Natalie might have jumped into a relationship for security or revenge? Dominic's smile was pleasant, but his eyes were steel. No, I'm sure you didn't mean to suggest anything so insulting about your own cousin's character. James retreated with mumbled apologies, and I squeezed Dominic's hand gratefully. You're enjoying this entirely too much. Watching small-minded people recalibrate their assumptions about you? Absolutely. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. Though I should mention, your ex-fiancé has been staring at us for the past 10 minutes with an expression I can only describe as deeply conflicted. I glanced toward the head table where Trevor sat beside Penelope, who was chatting with bridesmaids. But Trevor's attention was fixed on us, his face a study in complicated emotions. Regret is an ugly color on him, I observed quietly. Indeed. Shall we dance and give him something more interesting to regret? The band had started playing, and couples were moving toward the makeshift dance floor. Dominic led me into an easy waltz, and I was grateful for the ballroom dance lessons Constance had insisted we take together months ago, ostensibly for charity gala season, but proving useful now. As we moved across the floor, I caught fragments of conversation from nearby Millbrook relatives. Married Dominic Ashford, can you believe? Position at some prestigious arts foundation. Looks absolutely stunning, nothing like how she looked after. The collective reassessment was almost audible. I'd arrived in their narrative as the abandoned bride, the woman to be pitied. But that story no longer fit the evidence before them, and I could see them struggling to reconcile their assumptions with reality. My mother appeared at the edge of the dance floor, having clearly just arrived after her shift at the hospital. She took one look at me dancing with Dominic, wearing what appeared to be a wedding ring, and her face cycled rapidly through confusion, concern, and then understanding as I caught her eye and gave a subtle shake of my head. When the song ended, I excused myself to find her. She was standing near the garden entrance, arms crossed, expression somewhere between amused and exasperated. Natalie Monroe, are you going to explain why half your relatives just congratulated me on your marriage that I apparently wasn't invited to? It's complicated, I said, then quickly outlined what had happened. Dominic's spontaneous claim, my decision to go along with it, the performance we'd been maintaining. My mother listened, her expression softening. So you're not actually married? Not legally, no. Though Dominic and I have been dating seriously for over a year. And this elaborate charade is about what, exactly? Proving something to Trevor and Penelope? The question forced me to examine my motivations with uncomfortable clarity. Maybe initially. But honestly, Mom, watching them process that I'm not just surviving but thriving, that felt important. They expected me to be broken, and I'm not. You could have shown them that without pretending to be married to Charleston royalty. I could have, I admitted. But would it have made the same impact? Would they have truly understood how completely I've moved beyond them? My mother studied me for a long moment. Just be careful, sweetheart. Performances have a way of becoming complicated when real feelings are involved. Her words lingered as I returned to Dominic's side. We'd been play acting for the past hour, but the foundation underneath, our genuine relationship, my real accomplishments, his authentic support, was solid. The embellishment was just that, enhancement of truth rather than fabrication. As the reception continued, Trevor found a moment to approach us while Penelope was occupied with photographer obligations. His expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Natalie, could I speak with you privately for a moment? Dominic's hand tightened slightly on mine, a silent question. I nodded reassurance, and he stepped away toward where Constance was holding court with several Charleston society matrons. What is it, Trevor? He glanced around, ensuring we had relative privacy near the edge of the garden. I need to know, are you actually happy? Or is this all just for show? The question surprised me with its directness. Why does it matter? Because if I ruined your life, if you spent 2 years trying to prove something to me and ended up in some marriage of convenience with a rich guy, he ran his hand through his hair, a familiar gesture of frustration. I need to know I didn't completely destroy you. The self-centered nature of his concern would have been laughable if it weren't so predictable. Even now, trying to express regret, he was making it about his own guilt rather than my actual well-being. Trevor, whether I'm happy or not has nothing to do with you anymore, I said quietly. Yes, what you did was devastating. Yes, it hurt in ways I didn't think possible. But you didn't destroy me, you freed me from a future that would have been fundamentally wrong. What do you mean? I mean that I'd spent years making myself smaller to fit into your vision of what our life should be. I gave up career dreams because they seemed impractical compared to your stable path. I convinced myself that supporting your ambitions was the same as having my own. I met his eyes directly. If you hadn't left, I'd probably still be in Millbrook, teaching and hosting dinner parties and wondering why I felt so hollow. Trevor flinched. I didn't ask you to give up your dreams. You didn't have to ask. I offered them up because I thought that's what love meant, sacrifice and compromise and making someone else's success possible. I glanced toward where Dominic stood, now in animated conversation with several wedding guests. What I have with Dominic is completely different. He encourages my ambition, celebrates my success, and never asks me to be anything other than exactly who I am. So you do love him, Trevor said quietly. The question caught me off guard because I'd been so focused on the performance that I hadn't examined the underlying truth. Did I love Dominic? The easy partnership we'd built, the way he challenged and supported me simultaneously, the fact that I could imagine a future with him without having to diminish myself, was that love? Yes, I said, and realized it was true. I do love him. Maybe not in the desperate, consuming way I thought I loved you. But in a steadier, more sustainable way that actually makes me better rather than smaller. Trevor nodded slowly, something defeated in his posture. Then I'm glad. I know that probably sounds hollow, but I mean it. You deserve to be happy, Natalie. You do too, Trevor. I hope you and Penelope build something real together. As he walked away, I felt the final thread connecting me to my old life snap cleanly. Whatever lingering resentment or hurt I'd carried had dissolved, leaving only neutral observation of people who used to matter but no longer did. Dominic returned to my side, reading my expression with the intuition he developed over months of growing intimacy. Everything all right? More than all right. I think I just achieved actual closure. The reception wound down as evening deepened into night. Penelope and Trevor departed in a shower of rose petals and well wishes, heading to their honeymoon in Turks and Caicos. The Millbrook contingent gradually filtered out, several stopping to exchange contact information with me and make vague promises to visit Charleston. Constance kissed my cheek as we prepared to leave. You handled that beautifully, dear. Though I suspect tomorrow you'll need to have a serious conversation with Dominic about whether that performance was entirely fictional. She swept away before I could respond, leaving me standing with Dominic in the plantation's parking lot under a canopy of stars. She's not wrong, Dominic said quietly. We should probably talk about what just happened. We pretended to be married to impress my ex-fiancé and prove I'm not a tragic abandoned bride. We pretended to be married because apparently when I'm with you, pretending to be permanently committed feels more natural than I expected. He turned to face me fully, his expression serious in the dim light. Natalie, I know we've been taking things slowly, being careful not to rush. But tonight made me realize something. My heart rate accelerated. What's that? That I don't actually want this to be pretend. Maybe not marriage immediately, we can take whatever time we need. But the commitment, the partnership, the building a life together? He took my hand, his thumb brushing across my ring finger where a fake wedding band had sat all evening. I want that to be real. The declaration should have terrified me. After Trevor's betrayal, I'd sworn to protect myself, to never be vulnerable enough to be destroyed again. But standing there with Dominic, I felt no fear, only certainty. I want that too, I said. The real version, not the performance. He smiled, and it was like sunrise, gradual but transformative. Good. Because I bought an actual ring 3 weeks ago and have been terrified to ask if you were ready. You bought a ring? A vintage sapphire, because I know you prefer colored stones to diamonds. It's sitting in my safe, waiting for the right moment. He paused. Though I'm realizing now that the right moment might be whenever we stop being afraid and just commit to what we're already building. I kissed him then, there in the parking lot of my cousin's wedding reception, under the South Carolina stars. And for the first time since Trevor had handed me that devastating letter, I felt not just recovered but renewed. The woman who'd been abandoned at the altar was gone. In her place stood someone who knew her own worth, who'd built success on her own terms, and who was ready to share that life with someone who saw her as an equal partner rather than a supporting character. Tomorrow we'd deal with the logistics of correcting the marriage rumor with my relatives. We'd have serious conversations about timelines and futures and what commitment actually meant to both of us. But tonight, I simply stood in Dominic's arms and marveled at the extraordinary fact that the worst thing that ever happened to me had somehow led to the best thing I'd ever found. 6 months after Penelope's wedding, the marriage pretense had evolved into something more concrete. Dominic proposed officially in October on the foundation's rooftop terrace during a private dinner he'd arranged, with the sapphire ring he'd mentioned and a speech about building authentic futures rather than performing for anyone's benefit. We'd set the wedding date for the following spring, a small ceremony in Charleston with only close friends and family, deliberately intimate rather than the production my first wedding attempt had been. No 200 guests, no elaborate reception, just the people who genuinely supported our journey. My parents were thrilled. Lauren was serving as maid of honor with strict instructions that she was not allowed to run off with the groom. And Constance had taken to wedding planning with the focused intensity of a military general, though she respected our desire for simplicity. The foundation continued flourishing under Judith's leadership and my expanded programming role. We'd attracted national attention for our community engagement model, and I'd been invited to speak at several conferences about arts accessibility and sustainable funding strategies. Life had achieved a rhythm that felt both stable and dynamic, professionally challenging, personally fulfilling, completely removed from the chaos that had preceded it. Then, on a gray February afternoon, my carefully constructed piece shattered with a single phone call. I was reviewing exhibition proposals when my phone lit up with my mother's number. She rarely called during work hours, which immediately triggered concern. "Mom? Everything okay?" "Natalie, I need to tell you something before you hear it through the family gossip network." Her voice was tight with an emotion I couldn't identify. "Trevor and Penelope are getting divorced." I set down my pen carefully. "Divorced?" "They've barely been married 7 months. 6 months and 3 weeks, to be precise. Your Aunt Diane is devastated. Apparently it's been extremely messy. Penelope filed last week citing irreconcilable differences and adultery." "Adultery?" The word came out sharper than intended. "Trevor cheated on Penelope?" "According to Diane, it's complicated. There are accusations on both sides. Trevor claims Penelope was having an affair with someone from her work. Penelope claims Trevor never stopped seeing some woman he was involved with before their wedding." My mother paused. "It's a disaster, Natalie. Very public, very ugly." I processed this information, waiting for some surge of satisfaction or vindication. Instead, I felt only tired recognition of patterns repeating themselves. "How are you feeling about this?" my mother asked gently. "Honestly, I feel nothing except confirmation that they were exactly who they showed themselves to be." I glanced at my engagement ring, the sapphire catching light from my desk lamp. People who build relationships on betrayal shouldn't be surprised when betrayal follows them. After hanging up, I sat with the news for several minutes before Judith knocked on my open door. "You look troubled." "Bad news?" I explained briefly about Trevor and Penelope's imploding marriage. Judith, who'd heard the full story of my abandoned wedding over the years, shook her head. "Karma's poetic, but it's rarely satisfying when it actually arrives," she observed. "You're not tempted to feel vindicated?" "I'm tempted to feel relieved that I escaped that entire dynamic. Can you imagine if Trevor had waited another year before revealing his character? I could have been legally bound to him when it all fell apart. Instead, you're marrying someone who treats you as an equal partner and supports your ambitions." Judith smiled. "I'd say you came out ahead." The story should have ended there, my ex-fiancé's predictable marital collapse proving I'd dodged a bullet, me continuing forward with my genuinely healthy relationship. But life, I'd learned, rarely follows clean narrative arcs. 3 weeks later, Trevor called me directly. I was at home, reviewing wedding seating charts with Dominic when my phone buzzed with a number I'd deleted from contacts but still recognized from the area code and prefix. "Don't answer it," Dominic said quietly, seeing my hesitation. But curiosity won. I stepped onto our balcony and answered. "Hello? Natalie. It's Trevor." His voice sounded hollow, defeated in a way I'd never heard. "I know I have no right to call, but I need to talk to you. Trevor, we have nothing to discuss. I heard about your divorce, and I'm sorry it's difficult, but she was cheating the whole time." The words tumbled out rushed and desperate. Even before our wedding. With her boss at the marketing firm. I found emails going back months before we got married. I closed my eyes, recognizing the script he was reading from. The betrayed partner seeking sympathy, trying to rewrite history so he was victim rather than architect of his own situation. That's terrible, Trevor. But I'm not the person you should be calling about your marriage problems. You're the only person who understands what this feels like, being betrayed by someone you trusted completely. His laugh was bitter. The irony isn't lost on me. I did exactly this to you, and now it's happening to me. Actually, it's not the same at all, I said quietly. You chose to pursue Penelope while engaged to me. You made deliberate decisions to betray my trust. If Penelope was unfaithful, that's a separate issue in your marriage, not karma coming full circle. I know. I was terrible to you. I've realized that over these past months. His voice cracked slightly. I threw away something real for something that was never going to last. You and we had a foundation. What I had with Penelope was just attraction and impulse. The attempted revision of our relationship into something more substantial than it had actually been was almost offensive. Trevor, we didn't have the foundation you're imagining. If we did, you wouldn't have been able to fall for someone else so easily. The relationship you're romanticizing never actually existed. That's not true. We were good together, Natalie. We understood each other. No, I accommodated you. I made myself smaller to fit into your vision of what our life should be. That's not understanding, that's one person subjugating themselves for the other's comfort. Silence stretched between us. When Trevor spoke again, his voice had shifted to something more calculating. I saw the announcement about your engagement to Dominic Ashford. Congratulations. Thank you. Must be nice, marrying into that kind of wealth and social position. Solving all your problems with one strategic relationship. The implication, that I'd chosen Dominic for his money and status rather than genuine connection, landed exactly as he'd intended. A small barb designed to diminish my happiness. Dominic and I built our relationship over more than a year of genuine partnership, I said evenly. We support each other's goals, respect each other's ambitions, and treat each other as equals. It's everything you and I never had. Right. Well, I'm happy for you. His tone suggested otherwise. I just thought you should know what kind of person Penelope really was. In case you ever doubted whether you should forgive her. I don't think about forgiving Penelope because I don't think about Penelope at all, I replied honestly. You both made choices that hurt me, and I made the choice to build a completely different life. Your marriage falling apart doesn't change my trajectory one bit. After ending the call, I returned inside to find Dominic watching me with concerned eyes. He wanted sympathy, I explained, settling beside him on the couch. And possibly to undermine my happiness by suggesting I'd only chosen you for strategic reasons. Dominic's jaw tightened. That's rich coming from someone who left you for a woman with family money and connections. Projection is a powerful thing. I leaned against his shoulder. But it clarified something for me. I thought seeing their marriage fail might feel like vindication, but it just feels sad. Two people who bonded over betraying others are surprised when betrayal defines their relationship. It's predictable tragedy, not satisfying justice. You're more gracious than I'd be, Dominic said, pressing a kiss to my temple. I'm still tempted to find Trevor and explain in detail what an idiot he was. I laughed despite myself. You're not actually the violent type. No, but I could hire someone to deliver a very stern talking to. The attempt at humor lightened the mood, but the call had unsettled something. Not my feelings about Trevor, those remained firmly neutral, but my understanding of how closure actually works. I'd thought facing Trevor and Penelope at their wedding, watching them process my transformation, had provided complete closure. But Trevor's desperate call revealed that for him, our story wasn't finished. He was still writing his own narrative where I played a role, the one who got away, the relationship he'd foolishly sacrificed, the woman whose new success somehow reflected poorly on his choices. But I was done being a character in Trevor's story. My life had diverged so completely from his that we no longer shared even a narrative universe. The following week, word spread through the Millbrook gossip network that Trevor had moved back to North Carolina, taking a teaching position at a rural high school hours from anywhere significant. Penelope, meanwhile, had relocated to Atlanta with her boss-turned-boyfriend, apparently unbothered by the wreckage of her brief marriage. My Aunt Diane called to apologize, a rambling, tearful conversation where she acknowledged she'd been wrong to expect me to understand Penelope's choices 2 years ago. The divorce had apparently clarified whose behavior had actually been indefensible. I should have supported you, she said, her voice thick with regret. Instead, I enabled Penelope's worst impulses because I couldn't see past wanting her to be happy. The apology was appreciated but ultimately unnecessary. I'd stopped needing my extended family's validation months ago, building a chosen family in Charleston that included Judith, foundation colleagues, Dominic's mother, and the friends I'd made through arts community connections. As March arrived and our wedding approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey from that devastating June afternoon to this moment. The abandoned bride had become engaged again, but the circumstances couldn't have been more different. This time, I was marrying as a full partner rather than a supporting character. This time, my career ambitions were celebrated rather than accommodated. This time, I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted, with no part of myself sacrificed for someone else's vision. The wedding itself was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in late April at a historic home in Charleston's French Quarter, just 40 guests, ceremony in the garden, reception in the intimate courtyard. Simple elegance rather than elaborate production. Lauren arrived 2 days early to help with final preparations. We were addressing thank you notes for wedding gifts when she brought up what we'd both been avoiding. Have you thought about the fact that your wedding is almost exactly 3 years after the one that didn't happen? I set down my pen, considering. I've thought about it. But the anniversary doesn't hurt anymore, it's just a date. You've come a long way from sleeping until noon in your childhood bedroom. We both have. You got the promotion to senior designer, bought your condo, finally dumped that guy who wouldn't commit. Lauren laughed. Watching you rebuild your life definitely inspired me to stop settling for less than I deserved. She reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I'm proud of you, Nat. Not just for bouncing back, but for becoming someone completely new. The wedding day arrived with perfect spring weather, warm sunshine, gentle breeze carrying the scent of jasmine and wisteria. My mother helped me into my dress, a simple silk sheath in champagne that felt infinitely more me than the elaborate gown I'd worn 3 years ago. No veil this time. No 40 tiny buttons. No performance for 200 guests. Just me, exactly as I was, preparing to marry someone who loved that authentic version. The ceremony was brief and personal. Dominic and I had written our own vows, promises about partnership and growth and supporting each other's becoming rather than traditional pledges of obedience and sacrifice. When the officiant pronounced us married and Dominic kissed me, I felt none of the nervous anticipation I'd experienced before. Just certainty that this was right, real, and built on foundations solid enough to weather whatever challenges might come. The reception was intimate and joyful, good food, better wine, toasts from Judith and Constance and Lauren that made everyone laugh and cry. My parents looked genuinely happy rather than anxious. Dominic's friends from his sustainable development ventures mingled easily with my arts community colleagues. As the sun set and string lights illuminated the courtyard, I stood beside my new husband and marveled at the life I'd built from the ruins of my old one. What are you thinking? Dominic asked, his arm around my waist. That 3 years ago, I couldn't have imagined this moment. I was so broken I could barely function, and now I'm here, married to someone extraordinary, thriving in a career I love, surrounded by people who genuinely care about me. You did that, Natalie. You rebuilt yourself from nothing. Not nothing, I corrected gently. From something painful that forced me to examine what I actually wanted rather than what I thought I should want. Later that night, as guests departed and we prepared to leave for our honeymoon in Portugal, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the wedding announcement in the Charleston paper. You looked beautiful. I hope you're truly happy. T. I showed it to Dominic, who raised an eyebrow. Are you going to respond? I considered for a moment, then deleted the message without replying. Trevor's opinion, his approval or jealousy or regret, was completely irrelevant to my actual happiness. There's nothing to say, I told Dominic. That chapter closed a long time ago. As we drove away from the reception venue toward our hotel, I caught a glimpse of myself in the car window reflection, not the abandoned bride, not the woman proving something to her ex, but simply Natalie Ashford-Monroe, creating a future entirely on her own terms. The woman Trevor had left at the altar was gone. In her place was someone who discovered that the best revenge wasn't making them regret losing you, it was building a life so fulfilling that whether they regretted anything became completely beside the point. 2 years after our Charleston wedding, life had settled into something I'd never experienced before, sustainable contentment. Not the fragile happiness that requires constant maintenance, but deep satisfaction rooted in authentic choices and genuine partnership. The Hartley Arts Foundation had undergone significant expansion. Judith had announced her retirement plans, and after a lengthy search process, the board had offered me the position of executive director. At 34, I'd become the youngest person to lead the organization in its 40-year history. The promotion brought increased responsibility, fundraising strategy, board relations, organizational vision, but also the opportunity to shape the foundation's future according to values I'd developed through years of hands-on programming work. We'd expanded our public art initiative to 3 additional cities, established a fellowship program for emerging curators, and doubled our operating budget through strategic donor cultivation. Dominic's sustainable development firm had opened a Charleston headquarters, allowing him to work primarily from our home city rather than traveling constantly. We'd purchased a historic single house in the Ansonboro neighborhood, not as grand as some Charleston properties, but ours, filled with art we'd collected together and furniture that reflected our combined aesthetic. My relationship with my parents had deepened now that I lived my own life rather than the one they'd imagined for me. They visited quarterly, my father helping Dominic with restoration projects on our historic home, my mother cooking elaborate meals in our updated kitchen. The tension that had characterized my engagement to Trevor, their subtle disappointment that I'd given up career dreams, their forced enthusiasm for choices that diminished me, had been replaced by genuine pride in what I'd built. Lauren had moved to Charlotte for her design career, close enough for regular visits. We'd maintained the friendship that had sustained me through my darkest period, but it had evolved as both our lives expanded. She was dating a civil engineer she'd met through work, someone who encouraged her ambitions rather than competing with them. Even my relationship with the extended family had achieved equilibrium. My Aunt Diane and I maintained polite distance, occasional phone calls on holidays, generic well wishes, but none of the closeness we'd once shared. Penelope had become a non-entity in family gatherings, her name rarely mentioned after the divorce and hasty relocation to Atlanta. The life I'd built bore no resemblance to the one I'd planned at 28. And that divergence, once a source of pain, had become my greatest blessing. On a humid August afternoon, I was in my office reviewing applications for our Emerging Curator Fellowship when my assistant knocked on the open door. "There's someone here to see you." "No appointment, but she says it's important." "Penelope Hartford?" The name landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through my carefully maintained peace. I hadn't seen or spoken to Penelope since her wedding reception 2 years ago, where Dominic and I had performed our married couple charade. "Give me 5 minutes, then send her in," I said, needing time to compose myself. I stood at my office window overlooking Charleston's rooftops, processing the intrusion of my past into my present. What could Penelope possibly want after all this time? Money? Forgiveness? Some attempt at relationship repair? When she entered my office, I was struck by how diminished she appeared. The glossy confidence she'd projected at her wedding had been replaced by something harder, more worn. She wore business casual clothing that suggested professional employment but lacked the designer polish she'd once favored. Her hair, previously highlighted and styled, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Natalie. Thank you for seeing me. Her voice was quieter than I remembered, uncertain. Penelope. I gestured to the chairs across from my desk, maintaining professional distance. This is unexpected. She sat carefully, hands clasped in her lap. I'm in Charleston for work. The marketing firm I work for has a client here. When I saw your name in a local business article about the foundation's expansion, I thought maybe we could talk. About what? About what happened. About how I hurt you. She met my eyes directly for the first time. I owe you an apology, Natalie. A real one, not the half-hearted thing I offered at my wedding. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. You've been divorced for over a year and a half. Why apologize now? Because therapy has helped me understand what I did and why I did it. She took a shaky breath. I was coming off a terrible divorce, feeling worthless and invisible. Trevor paid attention to me, made me feel desirable again. And the fact that he was yours, that made it feel even more validating, like I was winning some competition I'd invented in my head. The honesty was unexpected. I'd anticipated defensive justifications or requests for forgiveness that centered her own need for absolution. This felt different, more like confession than manipulation. You destroyed my wedding day, I said quietly. You betrayed family trust for what, an ego boost? Yes. Her voice cracked slightly. I was so focused on my own pain that I couldn't see past it to the damage I was causing. I told myself it was real love, that Trevor and I had some special connection that justified hurting you. But the truth is, we had attraction and mutual selfishness. That's not enough to build a real relationship on. Is that why the marriage failed? Penelope laughed bitterly. The marriage failed because we were both fundamentally dishonest people trying to build something on a foundation of betrayal. Trevor cheated because that's what he does when things get difficult. I cheated because I never actually loved him. I loved the idea of being chosen over you. The admission should have hurt, but I felt only distant pity for the woman sitting across from me. She'd sacrificed family relationships and moral integrity for a hollow victory that had predictably crumbled. I saw the announcement about your promotion to executive director, Penelope continued. And your marriage to Dominic Ashford. You've built an incredible life here. I have, I agreed, refusing to minimize my accomplishments to make her more comfortable. I'm happy for you. Genuinely. She twisted her hands together. I know I have no right to your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did was unforgivable. You deserved better from family, and you deserved better from a friend. We sat in silence for a moment. I examined my feelings, searching for residual anger or hurt. But all I found was neutrality, the kind that comes from complete emotional distance. I appreciate the apology, I said finally. But you're right that I can't forgive what happened. Not because I'm holding on to anger, but because forgiveness implies a relationship worth repairing. We don't have that anymore. Penelope nodded, tears forming. I understand. What happened taught me something valuable, though, I continued. It showed me I'd been living a life that didn't fit who I actually was. If you hadn't done what you did, I might have married Trevor and spent decades being unhappy without understanding why. So I did you a favor? There was a hint of hope in her voice, seeking absolution through reframing. No. You committed a cruel betrayal that caused real damage. But the consequences of that betrayal forced me to rebuild in ways that ultimately served me better than the life I'd planned. I stood, signaling the conversation was ending. Those are two separate truths, Penelope. Your actions were wrong regardless of how things turned out for me. She stood as well, gathering her purse. You're right. I'm sorry, Natalie. For all of it. After she left, I sat at my desk for a long time, processing the encounter. The apology had provided a certain completion, acknowledgement of harm done, recognition of consequences faced. But it hadn't changed anything fundamental. My life had moved so far beyond that betrayal that Penelope's regret felt like an artifact from someone else's story. That evening, I told Dominic about the unexpected visit over dinner on our piazza. "How do you feel?" he asked, always tuning into my emotional state. "Grateful, actually. Not for what she did, but for the clarity seeing her provided. She's still trapped in the narrative of our shared past, still defining herself in relation to choices she made years ago. But I'm not." That chapter closed so completely that her presence barely registered. That's significant growth from the woman who agreed to pretend we were married just to prove a point at her wedding. I laughed at the memory. That seems like a lifetime ago. Different person entirely. Not different, evolved. The core of who you are was always there. You just had to dig through a lot of other people's expectations to find it. 3 months later, the foundation hosted our annual gala, the major fundraising event I'd once assisted with as a nervous new coordinator, now leading as executive director. The evening was flawless, record attendance, major gift announcements, recognition for our expanded programming. Standing at the podium to deliver closing remarks, I looked out at the assembled donors, board members, and arts community leaders who'd become my professional family. 5 years ago, I'd been sleeping until noon in my childhood bedroom, convinced my life was over. Now I was leading an organization that made tangible differences in communities across the Southeast. 5 years ago, I arrived in Charleston with little direction and even less confidence, I told the crowd. This foundation gave me not just employment but purpose. It showed me that starting over isn't failure, it's often the bravest choice we can make. Tonight's success represents what's possible when we invest in people's potential rather than their credentials, when we value vision over pedigree. The applause was gratifying, but what mattered more was the truth of the statement. I'd been hired because Judith saw hunger and determination beneath my sparse resume. That faith had catalyzed everything that followed. After the gala, Dominic and I walked home through Charleston's historic streets, our neighborhood quiet in the late evening. "I've been thinking about something," Dominic said as we approached our house. "We've been married 2 years, and you've achieved every professional goal you set. Maybe it's time to consider what comes next." "What comes next?" I echoed, curious about his direction. "Children, if you want them. Adopting a dog. Writing that book about sustainable arts funding models you keep mentioning. Whatever the next chapter looks like for us." The conversation we'd been circling for months had arrived. Children had felt impossible to consider when I was still healing from betrayal, still building career stability. But now, with professional success established and partnerships secured, the question had become viable. "I think I want children," I said slowly, testing the words. "But not immediately. Maybe in another year, once we've finished the house renovation and I've hired an associate director to help manage foundation operations." "That sounds perfect. No rush, just planning." Dominic squeezed my hand. "I like the idea of creating a family together, one built on intention rather than obligation." As we entered our home, I was struck by how different this conversation felt from discussions I'd had with Trevor about our theoretical future. Then, children had been abstract concepts to check off a life timeline. Now, they represented conscious choices made from abundance rather than adherence to social expectations. The following spring, I received an unexpected email from the Regional Arts Council offering me a position on their board of directors. The role would involve shaping arts policy across 5 states, influencing funding priorities and advocacy strategies at a level beyond my current foundation work. I called Judith, now enjoying retirement but still serving as my informal mentor, to discuss the opportunity. "It's exactly the kind of platform you've earned," she said. "But it's also a significant time commitment on top of directing the foundation. Can you manage both?" "I think so, especially once I hire the associate director. But there's part of me wondering if I'm overextending, trying to prove something I don't need to prove anymore." Judith was quiet for a moment. Here's the question. Are you considering this opportunity because it genuinely excites you and aligns with your values? Or because you're still running from something? The insight cut cleanly to the heart of my hesitation. For years, I'd been building and achieving partly to prove Trevor wrong, to demonstrate my value to anyone who doubted it. But those motivations had gradually faded, replaced by authentic engagement with work I loved. I think I'm excited because I care about art's accessibility and this role would allow me to influence policy at scale, I said, working through my thoughts aloud. Not because I need another title or accomplishment. Then accept it. Just remember that saying no to opportunities is also a valid choice as your life expands to include other priorities. I accepted the board position and hired an exceptional associate director, a young woman from Atlanta with innovative ideas about digital engagement and community partnerships. Watching her grow into the role reminded me of my own journey, the importance of being given opportunities before credentials fully justified them. On the 5th anniversary of my arrival in Charleston, I stood in my completed home, the renovation finally finished, and took stock of the life I'd built. Professional success that felt earned and sustainable. A marriage based on genuine partnership and mutual respect. Friendships rooted in authentic connection rather than social obligation. Financial stability I'd created through my own work. But more than any external achievement, I developed something that felt infinitely more valuable, a clear sense of who I was and what mattered to me, independent of anyone else's opinions or expectations. Trevor occasionally surfaced in my awareness through social media algorithms or Millbrook gossip networks. He'd remarried someone from his new town, a quiet ceremony with no drama. I felt only distant hope that he'd learned something from his previous failures. Penelope had apparently built a successful marketing career in Atlanta, maintaining professional distance from family. We'd never speak again, and that was fine. Some relationships aren't meant to be repaired, and their endings don't require reconciliation to achieve closure. What I'd learned through the entire journey, from abandoned bride to foundation director, from broken to whole, was that the best revenge wasn't making someone regret losing you. It was building a life so fulfilling that whether they regretted anything became completely irrelevant. The woman Trevor left at the altar had been convinced her value was determined by being chosen. The woman I'd become understood that real value comes from choosing yourself, your authentic path, your genuine priorities, your own definition of success. Standing in my Charleston home with Dominic's arms around me, looking out at the city that had given me space to rebuild, I realized I'd finally stopped measuring my life against what had been taken from me. Instead, I was simply living it, fully, intentionally, and entirely on my own terms. And that was the true happy ending. Not proving something to people who no longer mattered, but becoming someone I genuinely respected and enjoyed being. The past had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. And in that liberation, I'd found something far more valuable than revenge. I'd found myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.